Why has the SNP appointed a man who wants to break down the barrier between childhood and sexuality to be in charge of sex education resources in Scottish schools? I refer, of course, to Dr Colin Morrison, the project leader of the RSHP.scot sex education resources, recommended by the government, funded by local councils, the NHS. They're a conglomeration of government bodies. And Dr Colin Morrison also sits on the Scottish Education Council, which is a group of education so-called experts who meets to advise the government on educational issues. Here's Dr Morrison in action.
What they also tell us is that schools often don't make enough time for this. It gets a bit squeezed out. It's maybe not considered a serious topic. And so really the message to adults is, please give us more of this, please make it better quality, and please do it more regularly because we're interested.
So why do I say that Dr Morrison is a child sexuality advocate? Well, because I've read his dissertation. His PhD dissertation is available online, and he talks about the needs to break down the artificial barrier that's being created between childhood and sexuality. So instead of childhood and sexuality being kept separate, he wants them to be brought together again. So how far would I go? Would I go so far as to say he's a child sex advocate? My reading of his dissertation is that it seems that way to me. It seems to me that that's what he's saying. That's my honest interpretation. Now, if he wanted to debate that, if he wanted to clarify, he'd be very welcome. But he very definitely explicitly says, that this artificial barrier between childhood and sexuality needs to be broken down. Now, what that means, if it doesn't mean advocating for child sex, I really don't know. But that's what he's saying in his dissertation. Now, I made a video about Dr Morrison's views a couple of years ago. A lot of people were horrified by it, but I mentioned it more recently. I mentioned it at the Glasgow Cabby protest a few months ago. I mentioned it to a few other people. They hadn't heard about this before, and they were really horrified. Just disbelief. They couldn't believe that someone with these views had been appointed to these positions. So I thought maybe it's time to revisit the issue. At the time, I sent information to the mainstream media, various publications. No one would touch it, like there's a taboo in the media in Scotland about sex education. They just will not report anything about it. So I thought, what could I do? I thought I'll write to Shirley Ann Somerville, the Education Secretary, and express these serious concerns. Let's see how the government responds. So here's the letter that I sent. Dear Miss Somerville, I note the inclusion of Dr Colin Morrison in the Scottish Education Council and his leading role in the RSHP.scot sex education resources that you commend. I contend that Dr Morrison is rendered unfit for such roles on account of the views he expressed in his 2011 dissertation. I gave the link. This is available online. Some concerning excerpts follow where he outlines what he sees as the need to break down the artificial barrier between childhood and sexuality. Here, Dr Morrison bemoans the belief that children should be insulated from sexuality. Quote, there remains a problem when discussing sexuality and childhood because it requires us to understand the interface between the two in the context of a culture where the recognition of human sexuality in day-to-day life has become more and more dissociated from childhood. Childhood is understood, constructed, to be something separate from the realm of adulthood, and it is only in adulthood that sexuality can be understood and expressed. And you can probably see where I'm coming from. As far as I'm concerned, that sounds to me like a child sex advocate writing. That's my interpretation of that. It seems quite obvious to me that that's the point he's making. Anyway, carrying on. What's been created, it would seem, is an association, even obsession, between adult life and sexuality, and a growing gulf between childhood, as something special and different, and sexuality. A gulf between childhood and sexuality, to me that sounds absolutely the way it should be. Dr Morrison thinks no. Children should be exploring, experiencing sexuality. Anyway, Dr Morrison continues, in a world where we see children as vulnerable and in need of protection, Jackson argues that sexuality is in itself viewed as a threat to their well-being. Hawkes argues, identifying that arguably it is the attitudes of children and sexuality where tensions and anxieties, as well as the contradictions of modernist sexuality, are most evident. She confirms that the construction of children as being both asexual and sexually corruptible both innocent and dangerously impure, means that superficially the response of those doubts and fears was the separation of sexuality from childhood. Right, I know this is a bit unclear, but the whole dissertation is quite unclear. But anyway, it carries on. Separation of sexuality from childhood accomplished through what Foucault has called the pedagogization of children's sex, and that finally the monitoring and controlling of the distressing presence of sexual nature was to be accomplished through the attentions of medical experts and more indirectly through legal frameworks which distinguish children as a separate social category. Right, now what are these legal frameworks that distinguish children as a separate category with regard to sex? Well, they're obviously age of consent laws, aren't they? Obviously age of consent laws. Now, am I just hypothesizing wildly here? He's quoting Foucault there, who's very well known. His views were very well known. Colin Morrison there is quoting him positively about what I would say he wanted to remove the age of consent laws. Let's just read from the Wikipedia page about Foucault. Foucault was a proponent of adult-child underage sex and of paedophilia, considering them a form of liberation for both actors. He argued young children could give sexual consent. In 1977, along with Jean-Paul Sartre, Jacques Derrida and other intellectuals, Foucault signed a petition to the French Parliament calling for the decriminalisation of all so-called consensual sexual relations between adults and minors below the age of 15, the age of consent in France. So I can say with a huge degree of confidence that that quotation is about abolishing the age of consent, and Dr. Morrison quotes it positively. So one could conclude that Dr. Morrison is endorsing that position. Anyway, I'll carry on from my letter. Here, Dr. Morrison quotes with no disapproval advocates for bringing sexuality into childhood, by which he means up to 12 years old. That's what he means by childhood in the RSHP.scot resources. At the end of this passage, he quotes Foucault's complaint that age of consent laws are a result of the artificial and undesirable barrier between childhood and sexuality. The most natural interpretation is that Dr. Morrison himself agreed that age of consent laws are unnecessary. If you view Dr. Morrison's values as being in accord with the Scottish Government, you may wish to retain him in his current roles. If you, like us, regard his views as abhorrent, you will consider removing him from these positions. Having raised this serious concern, I look forward to your response. Yours faithfully, signed Richard Lucas. So send that email to Shirley Ann Somerville to her MSP email address. I think I sent it about 3 different times. I just got no reply. So I tried a different email address, so the general ministerial email address. And I did get a reply then. So, if you're going to reply to that letter with any integrity, you've basically got 3 options. Option number 1, you could reply saying, we agree. These views are abhorrent. We are removing Dr. Morrison from these positions. Thank you for letting us know. That would be option number 1. Option number 2, you could say we've looked into this, we've investigated his values, and actually we're not concerned. We think they're fine. So we're staying in these positions. That would be a reply with integrity and honesty. Option number 3 could be a sort of in-between reply. You could say, we've discussed this with Dr. Morrison. He's changed his mind about some of these issues, or you're misinterpreting, or whatever. So we decided he is suitable to stay. They're the 3 options with some integrity. Option number 4 would be to reply, but to completely ignore the content of my concern. Completely ignore it. Just reply with just some nonsense that doesn't really even acknowledge the concerns that I've raised. There's no prize for guessing which reply I got. I mean, obviously, number 4. So I wrote to them saying, here's someone that appears very strongly to me to be a child sex advocate, and certainly a child sexuality advocate, been appointed to be in charge of sex education resources in Scotland, an expert on the Scottish Education Council. And this is how they replied, just from a civil servant. Dear Mr. Lucas, thank you for your email and letter dated to the Cabinet Secretary for Education regarding your concerns about the inclusion of Dr. Colin Morrison on the Scottish Education Council. I've been asked to reply to you and would like to apologise for the time taken to respond to your initial correspondence. Members of the Scottish Education Council have a common purpose of improving education and are selected because of their knowledge and experience and because they represent a range of different groups and views. So they want a range of views. So do they need child sex advocates? Is that part of the range of views that it's important for the government to be listening to? It sounds like it is. Okay, anyway, carrying on. The Scottish Government also works with a wide range of partners in the development of education policy. Again, those partners are selected because of their knowledge and experience. The range of different groups and views is necessary to ensure that there's sufficient balance in policy development. So they're saying that maybe it's good to have a child sex advocate on the committees. I mean, there won't, there'll be other people with other views, but having that perspective enriches the discussion and helps them to formulate policy. That seems to be what it's saying. Because he made no effort at all to refute my suggestion that Dr. Morrison is a child sexuality advocate. Okay. After a similar selection process, based on knowledge and experience as well as expected delivery, was used by a partnership of health boards and local authorities in determining a contractor to deliver the relationship, sexual health and parenthood education online teaching resources. So I'm saying, here's someone who wants to break down the barrier between childhood and sexuality. You've given him responsibility for sex education resources, and the reply is, we chose someone through a process with the right experience and knowledge. Like, completely disregarding every point I made, no engagement with the issue at all. Completely ignored it. I mean, did they even look into it? Did they even read his dissertation? Probably not. They just got someone, can you just write a bland reply to this bloke to get rid of it? So they've ignored my concerns and just replied with that cut and paste, irrelevant, bland waffle, which they know full well doesn't address my concerns that I raised at all. I knew the reply would be like that. I knew it would when I actually managed to extract a reply from them. So you may say, what's the point of writing if you know that's where you're going to get? Well, the point of writing is to show the futility of writing and to demonstrate that what's needed is democratic change. It's on election day that there's power. It's through the democratic process that change is going to come. So support the Scottish Family Party, vote for the Scottish Family Party, and that's the way to really put these issues onto the political agenda. If you find this video interesting and concerning, do share it. Share it to people that you know, share it on social media, and do get involved in the Scottish Family Party. There are lots of ways you can do that, and you can see some of those via the links below.